what else is going on?
And the permission for the Beano.
Oh yeah, right, you've got the thing coming in school, right, I remember that. When's that, what day?
Monday, tomorrow. No, not tomorrow. Next
I need
week
to do
tomorrow.
that. A week on Monday, right.
Oh, and the Beano.
Let's just stick to this week, because I'll get really confused.
Yeah.
Zips.
Yeah,
Got it all.
Right, okay, on, let's go. You've got everything you need.
I'm 32 and I need to get a proper job now and sort my life out. It was only a part-time job. I was providing and I was proud of myself for doing that, but I was doing it in a really secure way. Kind of very quickly became apparent that it wasn't all I had made it out to be, I think, in my head. The pressure, levels of anxiety, stress, worry, all of those things then felt compounded because I couldn't get away. I could shut the laptop, but I couldn't leave work. It was constantly on my mind and I was constantly thinking about it. That expression had been taken away. It had gone. That negative feedback does become what you tell yourself. That's who I am and they're my thoughts and that's my mentality. I couldn't see a way that I could get out of that, I guess. Somebody that I really trusted and respected recommended Lean On. She was really set on it being a positive thing for me to apply to. So I did, and then kind of thought nothing of it. I was really conscious that it was an amazing offer. Things don't come up like that. And I kind of thought, okay, the time isn't right, but I'm going to go for it and throw myself into it and just see what happens. I was very surprised when I got the call to say that I'd been accepted onto the course. Lean On and the Platform 31 team wanted to see who I was, rather than me talking about who I am to impress them. To feel like you're being accepted for being you was a really big deal. I didn't really know what I wanted to get out of it, but I felt like it was going to be something that would give me tools that I could use for myself. There's not many organisations that say, we're going to give this to you for free, and this is just about you becoming the best version of you. Really was at a point in my life where I needed that support. It was feeding me as a person, as a whole person. So as a mother, a working mother, as a dancer, a mover, an artist. always thought of my job as also my creative practice, and it was just quite nice that I earned, a decent-ish living from it. But going through the Lean On process, I was like, I can actually make this more. Not just that I can earn more financially, but I can make this bigger. I can use this to have an impact on the wider community.
You've got a support network, and it's not just about going to a workshop and another one and then finishing a course. Actually, it's about creating friendships and bigger, stronger bonds.
It's probably quite a profound statement, but there were parts of my business and parts of myself that I think have been screaming to come out for years, and something in me hadn't quite had the confidence to do that. Lean On has really, really helped to facilitate that.
If you haven't got that kind of network, especially in a creative work or in creative field, it's quite hard to know as a freelancer where to go for that. And if you haven't been doing it for a long time, I think those are the kind of things that can stop you progressing.
I quit that job. I stopped my employment, but I said yes to me. I think a lot of elements of the programme really deeply, heavily impacted, for me, my mindset. I can be in charge of what I say to myself and how I speak to myself. For them to have that faith and trust in me being enough and being good enough, I'd sort of validated myself again, because I was being externally validated by the Lean On team, but also by the other women that were involved. That's what Lean On did for me.
If we want more women in leadership positions in the arts and cultural sector, then we must recognise and address the contexts many find themselves within. And that's about having few role models, uneven resource distribution, and a lack of transparency about what it takes to progress. And that's particularly impactful if you're a self-employed woman who also identifies as neurodiverse, global majority, or having a working class background. The Lean On programme takes the best professional development tools and approaches from across the sectors and combines them with a network of peers. It builds a discipline so women can lean on themselves and lean on each other, so they can build ambitious, rewarding, resilient creative work.